If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, the banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people, to whom it properly belongs.
I know it's a cliche, and we've all heard it and said it ourselves, that inflation is the cruelest kind of tax, hitting hardest those who can least afford it. I wonder, though, if we really understand that inflation is, in fact, a tax increase, a way government can raise more revenue without raising the rates.
Hello and welcome to another edition of Econ and Decon. I appreciate you joining me. I hope you've all come to love ED as much as I have. Today we're going to be talking about inflation. Now, inflation is a very important topic. It's not a partisan issue, but it's really not well understood by either the general public or even the media that does spend a lot of time talking about it. So with that being the case, we're going to dedicate a lot of time to this topic. This is going to be the first of a three-part series on inflation. Today we're just going to start with the groundwork, lay the foundation, how exactly to understand inflation and to understand when you're being lied to about it. In part two, we're going to talk about who benefits from inflation and how they're benefiting from hiding it from you. And then in part three, we're going to really dig into the nuts and bolts on how exactly they're hiding inflation from you and how exactly the government inflation numbers that come out every month are purposely understating the problem. So I hope you'll join me for all three. Stick around and learn something with me. And if you don't, that's fine. Just be ignorant forever. It's a free country. So to start off with, how did we get from that Ronald Reagan and that Thomas Jefferson message? How did we get from a point decades and centuries ago even where people understood that inflation was a problem, especially for poor people, and that it was essentially a hidden tax that poor people had to bear the cost of? How did we get from that to public officials going on TV and saying things like this?
We're very committed to achieving our 2% inflation objective and are well aware that for a number of years we've been running under that and recognize that there are dangers that would be associated with persistent undershoots of our inflation objective.
That's Federal Reserve Chairwoman Janet Yellen in 2017 talking about how inflation wasn't high enough and we needed to get it over 2%. She's now the Secretary of the Treasury, and she did it. All right, first of all, the idea that anybody knows exactly how much inflation the economy needs to be healthy is wildly arrogant, especially from somebody like Janet Yellen. If you look at her track record, her entire career is a history of her failing her way into promotions. She hasn't done well for the American people in any public office she's ever held. So how did we get here? How did we get to a point where somebody in that position of power can go on television and just tell you your prices and your bills aren't going up fast enough? And we just all accept it. To answer that question, we have to look at the definition of inflation. Now, in popular culture today, when you hear about it on television, or even if you look at it in the dictionary today, one of the definitions of inflation is prices going up. That's how we mostly understand inflation today. That wasn't always the definition. In fact, Merriam-Webster only started using that definition in 2003, in the 10th edition of Merriam-Webster. Before that, for the first 9 editions, and for all of American history, inflation was defined as an increase in the volume of money and credit, which can lead to price increases. Now, those definitions might not seem that different, but they are, because changing the definition to just an increase in prices absolutely obscures where inflation comes from. To understand the difference between these two definitions and how they relate to each other, the easiest place to start is with this equation. This is sometimes called the monetarist equation or the equation of exchange, but it's M times V equals P times Q. Now, M is the volume of money in the economy. It is the monetary base. Now, this is not just cash in your wallet, deposits at the bank, This also includes credits and loans that are given out because those are effectively spendable money that is then going out to circulate in the economy. This is what the original definition of inflation all the way until 2003 referred to. Next, we have V. V is the velocity of money. This is essentially how many times in a given year is the same dollar changing hands. The velocity of money kind of gives you an idea of how confident people are, how much expendable income do they have to go out and spend versus how much do they have to save. Typically, when the economy's not doing well and people don't have money to spend, velocity goes down. People save a little bit more. They just don't have as much to spend. And when the economy's really booming, velocity tends to go up. So on the money side of the equation, we have the total volume of money and credit times how fast people are spending it. On the good side of the equation, we have P times Q. Now, P is pretty self-explanatory. This is what the consumer price index from the government measures. It's just the general price level. It's essentially what we all think of today when we think of inflation. It is the new definition since the 10th edition of Merriam-Webster. Now, lastly, we have Q. Q is just the quantity of goods in the economy. Essentially, this is how productive are we? How many things are we making? How many things are there available to be bought with this limited amount of money? So if that seems hard to remember, just try to give yourself some sort of mnemonic device to help remember it, like my very pretty queen. Many velociraptors pee quietly. My very peculiar queer. We're allowed to say that now, right? Money velocity poses questions. Let's do that one. That actually is kind of relevant. We'll come back to that. So let's dig into these terms a little bit more so we can understand what's actually happening in this equation. Now again, M is the overall volume of money and credit in the system, and it has a direct relationship with P. What that means is when M goes up, prices go up if everything else stays the same. For this reason, you will hear people tell you a lot that inflation and prices going up always comes from governments and banks and the Federal Reserve increasing M. That's not exactly true. And the reason it's not exactly true is that velocity also has a direct relationship on price. So if M goes up and V goes down, the price might stay the same. Now, one side note I want to touch on is you'll hear a lot of people in America, only in America, you'll hear people say that printing a lot of money does not lead to an increase in prices. Famous useful idiot Paul Krugman says this all the time. You only find people who say that in America. And the reason is that America has a huge benefit, which we will talk about in another episode, but we essentially are the world's reserve currency. Are the world's reserve currency. What that means is most other countries hold a huge amount of dollars. They need dollars for international trade and for buying oil for, again, reasons that we'll get into in another video. But the whole world holds dollars. So when Venezuela or Zimbabwe or Argentina prints a bunch of their own currency, it all stays in their country. So you very quickly get 40, 80, 100% inflation in a year. And that's happened all throughout history. But in America, when we print a lot of dollars, it doesn't stay here. We export our inflation. We actually spread it throughout the whole world because the whole world is using dollars.
I have no soul. Have a nice day.
I don't have one either.
So the principle of MV equals PQ stays true, but we have a lot more leeway to print money than any other country on earth because of our reserve currency status. Again, we'll skip over P. It's the price level. It's pretty self-explanatory. But again, Q. Whereas M and V have a direct relationship with P, Q has an inverse relationship. So when the quantity of goods goes up, when the economy gets more productive, if everything on the money side of the equation stays the same, prices go down. And the opposite is true. When there are less goods being produced and everything stays the same, prices go up. So now that we understand how these things relate to each other, let's look at some real-world examples of how they've related to each other in the past. Now, you'll get a lot of people like famous useful idiot Paul Krugman who will tell you that printing money doesn't send prices up. And the reason they feel like they can say that, they all point to 2008. We printed a tremendous amount of money in 2008, 2009, all the way through 2014, really. in order to pump up the economy. That should have sent prices through the roof, right? Except there's V. The velocity of money in 2008 and 2009 plummeted. What that means is people didn't have money to spend. They had lost their houses. They had lost their jobs. People desperately needed deflation.
Deflation. Deflation.
But the banks and financial institutions desperately needed there not to be deflation. So the government printed a tremendous amount of money. So when you have M going up and V going down, price can actually stay relatively stable, which it did in the aftermath of 2008 and 2009. But again, only because people were screaming for falling prices and the government wouldn't let it happen. Now let's fast forward to the COVID pandemic in the last few years where we've had incredible inflation. You had the brilliant Joe Biden saying this.
Yeah, there's nobody suggesting there's unchecked inflation on the way. No serious economist.
I don't know if Joe Biden is just an idiot or Joe Biden is an idiot, but he also must be a liar. Okay. And Paul Krugman is a liar. The reason anybody who looked at this had to know that there was going to be inflation is, again, back to MV equals PQ. What happened in the COVID pandemic is a tremendous amount of new money was printed. M skyrocketed. In fact, 40% of all dollars in circulation in the U.S. economy have been printed since 2020. That is an incredible number. But at the same time, you had Q plummeting. So while M is going up, the government is shutting down businesses and producers and the supply chain is being choked. So you're skyrocketing M while you're plummeting Q. That is too much for V. There's nothing V can do about that.
No more! I can't take it anymore. No!
Price is going to go up. There's no other way that ends. Any economist or political pundit or commentator who is telling you in 2020 or 2021 that printing all this money and shutting people down was not going to increase the price level significantly was lying to you. Go back to your sources. Go back to the people you were listening to at that time. And if somebody was saying that at that time, stop listening to that person. Now, one thing I do want to mention briefly, I might do a short video about this after this inflation series just because so many people are talking about it. But it's this narrative that all the inflation is due to corporate greed. Don't buy into that narrative. Not that I don't think corporations are greedy. They are. But even if we want to pretend that greed started in 2020, the numbers just don't add up. The increase in corporate profits over the last few years does not even begin to account for the actual numbers we're seeing in the actual increase in the price level. It's not even close. So when you hear people like Richard Wolff or like Elizabeth Warren talking about how this is all just greedy corporations' fault, these are people who just either don't understand economics or they're heavily invested in the narrative. It's much easier to point the finger at the easy target of big corporations than it is to accept that your ideas and policies didn't work. No video on inflation would be complete without talking about the other side of the coin, the dreaded deflation. That we're all taught to fear deflation, but none of us actually know any better. Nobody watching this video has ever seen it. We haven't had a single year of falling prices since World War II. And that's in an economy that is constantly getting more productive. Q is skyrocketing and has been the whole time. And somehow prices have not come down. That is not a natural situation. You're taught to fear deflation, but deflation is no worse than inflation. Many people think that deflation is terrible. They associate it with depression because many people think that deflation is what caused the Great Depression. That is not true. That is propaganda. I'm going to do a video on the Great Depression, but there was deflation in the Great Depression, but that was a symptom. The Depression was caused by the 10 to 12 years that led up to the Depression. Deflation was a symptom that came along with a depression that was already there. But don't take my word for it. The National Bureau of Economic Research did a study a few years ago, and their conclusion was that there's no empirical link between deflation and depression. I mean, sure, we had deflation during the Great Depression, but we also had plenty of inflation during the Depression of the 1970s. And on the flip side, the period between 1870 and 1913 was the fastest period of growth in American history, and it was all deflationary. Prices were lower in 1913 than they were in 1870. And while plenty of people would tell you to be scared of that today, in real life, in the 1870s, over a 7-year period, real wages for workers grew by 20%. That actually matches the real wage growth of the last 110 years. In a 7-year period during deflation, what that means is workers got a greater share of increases in productivity in 7 years than they have in the last 110 years of increased productivity and constant inflation. The reason this is because, as we touched on in the Federal Reserve video, constant inflation is essentially a transfer of wealth from the poor and the working class and retirees to the asset owning class, to the government, to corporations, to banks. Workers have a hard time negotiating raises in inflation, but they don't need to in deflation. Prices go down, their wage stays the same. That's a good raise, and it's just as hard to negotiate a pay cut for your employees as it is a pay raise for yourself. Deflation is the opposite of inflation. You get a benefit to workers, to wage earners, to the poor, to the retirees. These people benefit from deflation at the expense of corporations, the government, and banks. Neither one of these is bad by themselves. Deflation, inflation, if they're 1%, 2%, 3%, you have a couple years of inflation, couple years of deflation, it's a little bit predictable. Neither of these are bad. This is the economy breathing. These are the scales balancing. This is how the economy works, but we haven't allowed it to work in 100 years. You are taught to fear deflation because the people who set up our financial system and the people running it today benefit from inflation at your expense, and you benefit from deflation at their expense, which is the only reason you are taught to fear deflation. You're taught to fear prices falling. Well, that about does it for this first episode in this inflation series. I hope you'll join me for the next one, where we'll talk about who exactly is benefiting from this inflation and how they've been benefiting from hiding it from you for decades. And then in the third episode, we'll talk about exactly how they've been hiding it from you. So hope you'll join me for both of those. Hope you enjoyed yourself and learned something today. If you have, please hit the like and subscribe button. It'll help me out a lot. Most importantly, please share this with your friends. We cannot solve problems until we understand problems. And these conversations just will not be had on television, so it's up to us to have it in our daily lives. And if you want to support the channel, you can also head on over to antitanktops.com. If nothing else, I promise you, you will find some clothing that'll start a conversation. So thanks again for joining me. This has been Econ and Decon. Peace.